if there was cooperation. And when I asked Scott, he said, I've worked with Kelly, and I thought we could talk more about how that works. And you know what I want to do first? Something kind of different, and I want to give them a hand for what they do in our legislature. We often complain about our lawmakers and what they're doing, but what they do is really hard. So I just want to give them a little appreciation. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Do you hear me okay? Let's try something different. I'll introduce Kelly and she can introduce me. So Dr. Kelly Morrison is someone I hadn't met until we both were elected in November of 2016, and I think it was a month later that, actually I take that back. It wasn't 16, it was 18. Yeah, it was 2000. That's right, yeah, I was 2 years ahead of her. I endured 2 years without her. But anyway, we got together for dinner, and there's 4 doctors in the legislature now. Dr. Kelly Morrison, an OBGYN doc, a Democrat in the House. And then there's another Democrat in the House, a physician, Elise Mann. She was elected also. And then Dr. Matt Klein is a senator, and he's a hospitalist at Hennepin County. And he and I were both elected in November of 2016. Prior to our being elected, there hadn't been a doctor in the Senate for 25 years, and there hadn't been a physician in the legislature for at least a decade. But Dr. Morrison has been just a breath of fresh air. She brings to the table a level of equanimity and really is, to my vantage point, never guilty of saying, oh, this is my position because this is a Democratic position. Nobody thinks for her. I don't even think her husband thinks for her. She might think for her husband. I'm done.
So I ran for the very first time in 2018. Is that better? No? I'm going to have to project then, which is hard for me. So I ran for office for the first time in 2018, and I did so because I was concerned about the state of political discourse, and I wanted to be part of positive, constructive problem solving. The theme of I'm a physician, as you all know. I'd been practicing in Minnesota for more than 18 years as an OBGYN. I've been married to my husband for more than 22 years. We have 3 teenagers who most days bring us a lot of joy. We have 2 dogs, and we've lived in Deep Haven for 10 years. The theme of my campaign was for a healthy, thriving Minnesota. And to me, those values mean how do we figure out how to get health care to the people of Minnesota who need it? How do we make sure that every child in Minnesota has access to an excellent public education? And how do we make sure we protect our environment, protect our beautiful lakes and rivers and natural resources, and address climate change? And it also meant gun violence prevention to me. So those values informed my legislative activities, but before we get into that, I want to tell you all that one of the very first people to contact me after the 2018 election was Senator Scott Jensen, and I had never met him before. I'd heard about him, of course, because he had really made a mark, obviously, in the Senate and in the legislature in general. He called me, he sent me a note. He said, let's the 4 of us physicians get together and form the Doctor Caucus. And I thought that was such a great start to my time. It was such a great welcome. The fact that he's a Republican was so meaningful to me. And we kind of got to work right away, well before session started. And I'm so grateful to him for he's mentored me in many ways, and I think that we've collaborated mostly in a really productive way. And I'm grateful for that and for his friendship. And I'm grateful to you guys for inviting us. I think this is such a wonderful idea to have a Republican and a Democrat come together, talk about the issues of the day, occasionally agree to disagree without being disagreeable. Yep. It can be done.
Yeah. One note to that, somewhere else in the Twin Cities, perhaps at this very time, there's Dr. Matt Klein, a senator, meeting with Senator Karen Housley, a Republican, a Democrat Republican, and they're having a church town hall on health care just as we are. So there is hope. There really is. I think a lot of times what we see on the news and the media and social media, it perhaps skews things, but there's an awful lot of us folks that really want to see things done, and we think that it can happen.
And I think the two of us also are very aware that in many ways what affects our lives the most is what happens at the state level, not the national level. And I think we can all agree it's pretty easy to get distracted by what's happening at the national level right now. And I think we've really tried to kind of keep our heads down and focus on what we can get done for Minnesota. And I think that's important. I think there are probably extremes in both of our parties who are distracting from some of that at times, to your point, that I think most of us live somewhere in the center, whether we're center right or center left. Most of us want to see compromise and collaboration and productivity.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. What is getting done? Yay. Scott told me to look at the Affordable Health Care Act and go down and see what was promised, the various health care things like prescription drugs, behavior and mental health. There was a whole list, and certain things stand out for sure. I think one of those is probably prescription drugs. And we've talked about insulin. That's been a topic. And what can Minnesota do with, say, insulin or prescription drugs for the folks that are here?
Well, we've both been involved in trying to break through some of the partisan divide on figuring out this insulin problem. And this really came to light after this young man named Alex Smith died. He died. He was 26 years old, which meant he had to go off his parents' insurance. And he was trying to be an independent young man, and I think was a little embarrassed when he realized he couldn't afford his insulin, so he started to ration it. And he was a type 1 diabetic who needs his insulin to survive. I mean, it's like air. He needs his insulin to live. And eventually he rationed it to the point where he died. He was 26 years old. In my mind, and I know in Senator Jensen's mind as well, that shouldn't happen in Minnesota in 2019. So the Alex Smith Emergency Insulin Act was started in the House and passed through and then sort of got lost in conference committee at the end of session. So we were part of a bipartisan, bicameral effort post-session to try to forge some compromise to get that done. And we're still working on it.
I think that's well said. This is one of the most intensely emotional issues for me. I mean, I've had the chance to take care of people with diabetic ketoacidosis for 40 years. People might say, well, why in the devil didn't this Alex Smith reach out and get some help? Well, he made an assumption, and it's not an unreasonable assumption. He thought that his diabetes, if he was doing too much in terms of rationing, would be sort of a linear pattern, and he'd be able to recognize when things got dangerous. And it isn't that way. It's one of those, if you will, one of those exponential things. And once your sugars start to get out of control, things deteriorate rapidly. And oftentimes you become obtunded or your mental faculties aren't as sharp. And instead of getting on the phone and calling someone, you might say, well, I'm just going to drink a glass of water and I'm going to take a nap. And that's how you die with diabetic ketoacidosis, when you're not being attended to. We did have a plan to move forward and try to do something for diabetics that are dependent on insulin. And I think it's an important issue, but I'll say this. To me, it's just a microcosm of the bigger issue. The bigger issue is in the 1970s when I went into medical school, we were having an active discussion in the doctor lounges all the time. Is healthcare a privilege or a right? And honestly, I think that ship has sailed. I think if we're going to say that in the Declaration of Independence, the words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness matter, we've taken measures in this country to make certain that there's a certain amount of food in your tummy, shelter over your head. And with that, there has to be some level of health care for everybody. So I think that we have to say that some basic package of health care for everybody is something that's doable in this country. It doesn't have to be extravagant. And to Jerry's reference to the Affordable Care Act, if you don't know the phrase or haven't heard of the phrase essential health benefits, I would beseech you, please learn about it. In the Affordable Care Act, there are 10 essential health benefits. Essential health benefits, EHB. If you put 10 EHB in your Google box, they'll pop up. And it's really a comprehensive Cadillac plan. It's way bigger than what Canada provides with their Medicare. Fact of the matter is, what a lot of people don't realize is the Affordable Care Act calls for such comprehensive scope in coverage that our Medicare plan, that some of you folks, I don't see anybody in here over 65, but some of you, if you are, some of you folks may be on Medicare, but you may not know that your Medicare plan is not a qualified health plan according to the Affordable Care Act, because Medicare doesn't cover vision, doesn't cover long-term care. I think I just lost my mic, didn't I? If you want me to use the mic or this, I'm back on again. But the bottom line is, we need to start talking about our terminology, because if we don't all on the same page, we're not going to get anywhere. So let me just say it again. The Affordable Care Act has a lot of good pieces to it. It really does. We can make that work. A lot of the basic ideas in the Affordable Care Act came from the Heartland Institute and the Republican Party in the 1980s. They were promoted in the 1990s. Where the Republicans really fell out of love with some of the stuff in the Affordable Care Act is as soon as Obama said he was going to use it. And that's what goes on in politics. But you need to understand the 10 essential health benefits are probably too big. Nobody else is providing that comprehensive a plan. When we talk about single payer simply means that we'd have one payer, and that'd be the government. When we talk about Medicare for all, right now, as Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are putting it out there, that's a plan that's bigger than Medicare. It's bigger than Canadian Medicare. It's bigger than most of the first world European countries are providing. So there's something in between that we could get done. And I think that's where Representative Morrison and I agree, is that if we could carve that out. So now let's circle back to the insulin issue. The reason I'm so darn passionate about the insulin issue is because it's making all of us have the discussion. If 10% of our population suffers from diabetes, and 10 to 20% of that portion is on insulin, then by George, is there any one of us in this room that isn't some way or another touched by diabetes? So this is the perfect opportunity. It's unfortunate that Alex Smith's life has been extinguished. But to honor not just Alec, but to honor all of us, we need this conversation about insulin, and the legislature needs to demonstrate that we can get it done without the bickering. Because if we do, then we can leapfrog to the next big issue, is what do we do for all Minnesotans, for all citizens of the United States, as a basic package of critical care? And then we can talk about the rest.
Do I dare ask what the bickering's about? Do I dare ask what the bickering is about? I mean, it seems, hello?
I'll be short because I was so long on the last answer.
Can you
I'll
be
say
short?
it's about three things. I think on the Republican side, I think they're fearful it's too much regulation. I think on the Democratic side, I think they see it as a perfect issue to go into the 2020 election cycle. It'll be a good one to play gotcha with. And those are two big things that drive us apart. The Republicans have got to stop thinking that regulation is always bad. One quick example, in 1996, the FTC came out and said, okay, we're going to make one specific rule. We're going to say that cell phone numbers are not the owner, they're not owned by the carrier, they're owned by the individual. They're portable. Small piece of regulation. In other words, if John Gavis wants to switch his carrier, he can keep his phone number. He doesn't have to go out and get new business cards and everything else. What that did was it just blew open the walls of what could be provided for us. And all of a sudden, our costs went down, our data costs went down, the bells and whistles increased, and basically we all have a lot better product than we had then. So regulation is not a bad thing. It just has to be thoughtful. And in the campaign season, I think we have to let go of insulin and stop using it as a gotcha point, or it's going to stop us from getting the work done.
I have thoughts. I do think some of it was just straight up partisanship. You know, we don't want to give the Democrats a win. We don't want to give the Republicans a win, so we're just going to stonewall each other. And some of it is the way this session ended. And there are ways in which I actually think we can feel very proud that in the only divided legislature in the country, we actually did craft a budget. We're living in times where we easily could have still had a government shutdown right now. So the fact that our leadership was able to get it done, yay. The fact that the manner in which it was done, I think most of us would agree, was not ideal. A lot of it was behind closed doors. A lot of it was among a very small group of people. We can do better than that, and yet I still think that there are ways in which we can feel positive about how it ended. In terms of what we do about insulin, boy, maybe we need to do a hybrid of the two plans that have been proposed, because they are different. The Alex Smith Emergency Insulin Act calls for an emergency supply for diabetics who are in crisis and need insulin that they can get immediately at a pharmacy. The Senate plan, which I think Eric Pratt is the lead author, right? I think so.
Yes.
Is more of a longer term. It's not an emergency plan, but it is a way to help diabetics who need their insulin get it. So maybe we need to do both. I agree with Senator Jensen that we can't use it as a political football, but I think it is an example of something that we have to break through this partisanship. We need to have more transparency in government, and perhaps we need to have more standalone bills rather than the big omnibus bills that can happen at the end of session.
So you're talking about leadership. You're talking about leaders who can lead and be authentic, as we talked about just before we started. Leaders who can go in and actually stand for something that maybe the rest of us can agree with, and instead of bullying one another, just go in and get it done.
I think that's right, and I also think it's important that we have an engaged populace. I think a lot of us sort of knee-jerk when we go into the voting booth, we vote R, we vote D, and that's what we do. We need to put our time in ourselves and learn who our candidates are and make sure that we're making thoughtful votes and try to get away from the hyper-partisanship, I think. I'm a fan of ranked choice voting, which I believe the senator is as well, which is, I think, a way to help us get away from that, and I'd be happy to talk about that. It's a little digression from healthcare, I realize. And yet it brings us back to how do we get things done for the people of Minnesota?
If you remember the end of the last session, I probably would take a little bit different perspective than Representative Morrison. I found very little that I could be proud of as we close things off. Yes, we got a budget done, but we had 5 months of work before that, and then we had conference committees with the various omnibus bills. There's about a dozen omnibus bills. And in the end, because we were so polarized, the governor and the Speaker of the House, Democrat, Hortman, and the majority leader in the Senate, Gazelka, the three of them basically, if you will, took over the entire process. We literally spent hours and hours on a Wednesday in a conference committee, and I think it had been like the 7th or 8th meeting I'd been at. I'd probably invested 25, 30 hours in trying to hammer this out, and all of a sudden it's gone. We didn't even get the courtesy to be told, oh, by the way, your conference committee has been terminated. But that's exactly what happened. Every conference committee was terminated, and we had a triumvirate. And when I think of the triumvirate, I always think back to the Roman Empire. I think when, if I remember right, Julius Caesar was killed. But we had a triumvirate. And what really offended me was as soon as we got done, here came the spin doctors. Everybody spinning, everybody running victory laps saying, didn't we do a fantastic job? Well, no, you didn't. Not one of the leaders stood up and said, I apologize to the conference committees. I apologize to the 201 legislators that worked their tail off, and we apologize to Minnesota. The good thing is, yeah, we got a budget, we didn't go into a shutdown. But my stars, if that's the best we can do, and you wonder why I don't want to go back.
Yep, and then, you know, what else they do is they go, okay, Paul Gazelka, you get to be on TV. You go, you're going to be the spokesperson, instead of having the real people. So, I mean, and I worked in that business, and it's easy to do, but there is then a lack of perspective.
I was the person that was supposed to carry the insulin bill, and the only reason I'm not carrying it now is because I'm being punished. Senator Gazelka said, well, there's no way in the world I'm going to give Jensen a win for being a renegade. So, he chose Eric Pratt, and Eric's a good guy, doesn't know a lot about insulin, but he's learning. And the fact of the matter is, there was no way in the world that I was going to be allowed to carry an insulin bill.
Okay, that's high school.
Yeah. Well, get used to it. And there's two big pieces. There's two big pieces to this insulin bill, just as Representative Morrison said. One is, what do you do after the immediate crisis is over? That, running out of insulin on a Saturday, you got to be able to get it. So that's the emergency part, and the Senate has been oblivious to that. But the Senate has added a good piece, which is, okay, once we're past that immediate crisis, how do we help that person until they get on their feet, potentially up for 12 months? And we have gotten the pharmaceutical manufacturers to come to the table and say that they will provide that. They will provide literally $5 to $10 million of insulin a year to make this program work. But we still don't have the emergency piece fixed, and we have to lean into the Democrat House because they've got it there. They've got the answer. So 2 weeks ago when Senator Gazelka tweeted that the Republicans had a perfectly good bill that if Walz would call a special session, we're ready to go, I read that and I thought, well, that's not true. And so I tweeted back. I said, with all due respect, Senator Gazelka, the Republicans don't have a solution. And our bill isn't ready for prime time. We need to take some from the House and work together. And that's what Representative Morrison is saying too. So, but you got a job in this too, folks. I mean, you've got to start being a titch more skeptic. When you hear this stuff on social media, you have an obligation just as much as I do to say to your elected leaders, when you see us, put the hard question to us. You don't have to be uncivil. You can put a hard question to us, but hold us accountable. You have to. We're in a time like we've never been before. Fake news is everywhere. And if you don't step up to the plate, then shame on you.
And I think from that, what I'm kind of hearing and learning maybe is it's important for us to be able to do things like this, where we hear from our representatives and ask them questions. And instead of maybe, I don't know if it's a rally or whatever, it's a protest, but actually have honest conversations. So I want to get questions from you all too, so I'll just kind of look here. Tom. You can continue to talk if you like.
While the questions are coming forth, why don't we give the chance to Representative Morrison, since I've been talking so darn much. Why don't you comment a couple of specific bills that you've been working on in terms of healthcare?
Well, obviously, as a physician, the healthcare piece is extremely important to me. I served as the Vice Chair of Health and Human Services in the House, the Policy Division. And I worked on a bunch of healthcare bills, and I'm proud to say that I think 80% of them had bipartisan authors. I really worked hard to reach across the aisle because I think that is so important. It's not always easy, but we have to do it. Politics is supposed to be the art of compromise. I keep saying that, but it's true. And I worked on a bill that I'm really proud of that didn't make it through, although it did make it through to conference committees and was lost there, called the Drug Price Transparency Act, that asks the pharmaceutical companies to explain why a new drug comes on market above a certain threshold, or why a drug that they've had increases exponentially over a 12 or 24-month period. And just ask them, what were the manufacturing costs, what were the distribution costs, what were the marketing costs, what was the profit margin, what's your estimate of research and development, and report that to the Commissioner of Health. No penalties unless you don't comply with it, but I think it's a way of increasing transparency. Figuring out the cost of prescription drugs is incredibly complicated, and there are a lot of actors who point the other direction to blame other people, and everyone has a piece of blame. But I think it's a part of peeling away the onion and trying to figure out how we can bring down the cost of prescription drugs. I could go on about more, but I'll let you ask your question.
Scott. Uh-oh. I'm losing my voice here. You say step up and say something, do something. It's like a drop of water that falls into a lake. Who do you step up to and complain? Who do you step up to that has the power to do something about our concerns? It seems like we all have concerns about what's going on with this. Nobody listens. How can you say shame on us for not stepping up? We have no place to step up to. Nobody listens.
I read a book once called Relationship Matters. Fact of the matter is I wrote that book.
That's yours.
Relationship Matters. You'd be surprised at how much influence you have if you make a phone call or just send a note to your House of Representatives member or your Senate members. We really do pay attention to those things. And when we start to see a certain tide coming, all of a sudden we start listening. I'd love to have Representative Morrison comment on this as well. But when we get the repeat ones where it's just been a batch, distributed by a certain group, or it's an email that all has the same words, granted, if I get 50 emails that all say the same thing in a day, I know that people haven't even read them. But a phone call or a note from a constituent, it really does impact on me. And if I got, if out of this group, you decided that 20 of you were going to write a note to Senator Dave Osmek, or to Representative Kelly Morrison, or to Representative Joe McDonald, it would register. It really would. Relationships do matter. And even though it may seem like it's a drop of water in a puddle or in a pond, I think it is a little bigger than that.
I agree. You have much more power than I think you're giving yourself credit for. There are a lot of ways to impact it. I agree with Senator Jensen that calling, writing, going to visit your legislators, and a group can go together. There is strength in numbers sometimes. Is important, and it makes a difference. I also think we have to hold our legislators accountable. Call them and ask when their next town hall is. I've held 10 town halls since I was elected that are open to everyone. I've really tried to be accessible to all my constituents, not just the ones who voted for me. And I really think that almost needs to be a requirement of office, that you have to be available to your constituents. We have to have these hard conversations. So call the governor, call the majority leader, call the Speaker of the House, call your state representative, call your senator, and go visit them.
I remember one of the most enjoyable campaign events I did in 2016 was, and I think some of you folks in this room were there, but I didn't want to do a fundraiser per se. I wanted to have a chance to influence more than just one person at a time because it's hard to hit 100,000 people. And so a woman said, well, I'd have a neighborhood coffee gathering or wine gathering, and would you be interested in coming? I said, sure. So I think it was like 6 o'clock at night, and there were maybe a dozen people there. And we went over and they had cheese and wine and we talked for about 45 minutes and that was it. And there was no fundraising, nothing like that. But that was a wonderful opportunity for me to hear what this dozen people were thinking and for me to share with them my view on it. And a lot of times my view would be maybe relatively primitively researched. And I oftentimes would say, I'm really not sure what to think on that. You're raising some points I haven't thought about before. I'm going to do some due diligence on that. Because just because you run doesn't mean all of a sudden you have instantaneous knowledge of the 250 issues that people might ask you about.
Bringing up fundraising reminds me as well how important campaign finance reform, I believe, is. We have to figure out how to get more transparency in that and how to get dark money out of both sides of this political debate. It is hugely problematic and it's very powerful.
To run for the governor of Minnesota, if you want to really have a legitimate campaign, $5 million minimum. That's crazy. We have state Senate seats this next cycle that will cost over $1 million. I raised $90,000 in my campaign, and I think I spent about 65 of it. And that was the most we've ever spent in Carver County on a race. And that was less than 100,000. We will have campaigns that will be over $1 million for a state Senate this year.
My opponent and allies spent $250,000 against me during the 2018 campaign and sent out more than 25 negative mailers. And I don't think that's productive. That's not a good use of money. I'm all for sending out comparison mailers. Let's send out, this is what I stand for, this is what my opponent stands for, in black and white, and then you, the voter, can decide how accurate that is. But just the flood of money that is most often used negatively is not productive.
In response to the legislative
I think that was one of our wins this year, is we did pass the opioid stewardship program, and that will generate $20 million to help deal with the opioid epidemic. The Attorney General is doing his own piece of that, but that was one of the big bipartisan wins, and it's one that that some of our colleagues who have lost children to the opioid epidemic, Democrat and Republican, because this is not a partisan issue like so many of these things, they have worked tirelessly for years to get it done. Dave Baker in the House, a Republican, and Chris Eaton in the Senate, who's a Democrat, both lost children to the opioid epidemic, and they've been incredible in getting this legislation through.
I agree with Representative Morrison completely. The opiate bill this year was a big win. This is one of the more ambitious bills in our country, and Dave Baker and Chris Eaton were champions. Julie Rosen and myself and Representative Morrison and a bunch of us jumped on board and tried to help as well.
Okay, we have another question back here.
Fair enough.
Just kind of related to the accessibility. I used to teach, and we would often bring kids down to the Capitol and to DC, and the kids were always impressed by the amount of access they had and the influence and contact they could have. Just kind of a numbers thing, how many constituents do you serve, and how many personal contacts would you get in a week or a day from those constituents that aren't form letters? What kind of response, what kind of contact are you getting from people?
Great question. So we have 67 Senate districts in Minnesota, and each of those represent 80,000 people. And each House district, there are 2 for each Senate district, so 40,000 people in each House district. I had more than 1,000 constituent contacts during session. I had a very active district.
I continue to have 1,000 contacts every week now, even out of session, between emails and text messages and phone calls. And I would say this, in 2010, we all had senators had 80,000 people, and representatives had 40,000 because there's 2 in each one. We have the largest Senate in the land. Minnesota Senate has 67 senators. Wisconsin has more people than we do. They have 33. California is 7 times our size. They have 40 senators total. We have 67. We have 134 representatives. To combine, we're the 5th largest legislature in the land. Every legislator, you can pretty much just tab on $500,000 is what it costs. I put a bill in to shrink the legislature. If we shrunk it by 25%, we could save $5 million every year easily. I couldn't get a hearing. This would be a perfect time to
That's
shrink.
surprising.
Yeah. Well, this would be a perfect time because we're going to get new census data coming out. And when we get new census data, what we could do is we could say, okay, we're going to not have 67 Senate districts, we'll have 49, and then we'll have twice that for House. So we'd have 49 and 98. That would still be large, but it would be better. People have said, well, then you're not going to have as much access. Whether you're representing 100,000 people or 80,000 people, that's not the thing. It's what Representative Morrison saying. If you have a commitment to stay accessible with 10 town hall meetings, and that's exemplary on her part, that's what matters. It isn't whether it's 80,000 or 100,000 or 40,000 or 50,000.
So I want to go back to healthcare because that's what we started talking about. And this gentleman was asking about the opioid crisis, and you said that money is being put towards dealing with and working on it. I want to know the how. What is going to be done to deal with the opioid crisis?
Well, the opioid crisis, just a couple of things that did pass this year is 61% of all opiate addicts presumably began their journey towards addiction through physician prescriptions. I'll own part of that. I didn't realize I was a part of the problem, but I was. And I see Dr. John Sherman here in the audience. And John and I have worked together for years on patients, and now we're a part of the same group. But one of the mistakes I made recurrently that I shouldn't have was when some of my patients would undergo surgery. Generally, the surgeon would take care of the pain management for the first 30 days. But after that, the surgeon was anxious to have the family or primary care doc resume control of the whole medication picture because medications impact on one another. Well, then I would take over after 30 days thinking I was sort of being a nice guy, but also seeing the rationale behind it. But what would happen is I would renew a prescription for another 30 days, and then perhaps another 30 days. And the patient would come in and say, I'm still having pain. And without the surgeon ever knowing it, I might be on the 4th or 5th month of narcotic prescriptions. My bad. After 90 days, it's pretty easy to get addicted to opiates. This happened around the country. So physicians have to own it. So the bill said physicians cannot prescribe more than 7 days of medication without going to the PMP system and finding out, does this patient have a history? That's just one small piece in it. And there's other pieces, but I'll just pass on that for now.
Yeah, very well said. Physicians have to own that we had a huge role in this. When I was going through training, physicians were criticized for under-treating pain, and then the pendulum swung way too far to the other side, and we over-treated pain. And before we had the physician monitoring program, there was people could shop. Once they got hooked, they could go from doctor to doctor, and we go into medicine because we want to help people, and we were very sympathetic to people who were in pain, and so we'd give them more. So we definitely have a role. I think that some of the limits that are placed on physician prescribing in this bill were excellent, and they also leave room for physician discretion, which I thought was important because there are exceptions. But physicians are imperfect, obviously. You all have experienced that yourselves. So making sure that they are educated about what they have to do is important. In terms of, so there's money for prevention, there's money for treatment, there's an advisory council from many different stakeholders to help advise the Attorney General and the Governor and the legislature on progress and things that we need to do going forward. But the money primarily comes from the pharmaceutical companies.
So we're going to wrap up, and I'm wondering if you might have some advice for us just in our everyday lives about how we can come together with someone who we're having a difference with, or someone who is different than us. What have you learned?
What a great question, and it's one that we should all right now wake up every morning asking ourselves that question, I think. And I think our common Christian background demands that we do that. We need to embrace the stranger and love our neighbors as we love ourselves and we love our God. It's hugely important now more than ever. And so I would encourage people to reach out to someone who you know has a different opinion about things than you do. Take them out to coffee. Talk about it. Recognize that you can agree to disagree. And sometimes you have to swallow. Sometimes you have to count to 3 in your mind. But in the end, we all have so much more in common than we don't. It's not even close. We're so similar, all people, no matter what our background is, no matter what our religion is. So wake up in the morning, embrace the other, embrace the stranger, embrace the refugee. And we need to, you hear a lot about, let's go back to civil discourse. I think we need to move forward into the future and find a new and better kind of way to live together. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I would think that every one of us in this room probably can think of some relationship we have that perhaps at some juncture in time didn't seem like it was going to be a relationship. I remember growing up in Sleepy Eye, Minnesota, where we thought that international cuisine represented for the Italians pizza and for the Chinese chow mein. And we had no international cuisine. And the fact of the matter is, when I got to University of Minnesota and I met people that didn't look like me, I didn't expect them to become my friends, but some of them are my best friends. And I think if we take those past experiences and project them into the future, we'll realize that who knows 2 years from now or 5 years from now, who might be someone that we confide in and trust very, very much, and they may be dramatically different. And then, of course, we can say that this is exactly how this country came together, is at some level, clearly, we're all immigrants. To the question of faith, this isn't something that Mary and I wanted to do. We really didn't think we needed the Senate to be complete. And I remember there were 3 verses that really were compelling for us. In Esther 4:14, Mordecai challenges Esther by saying, have you thought that it's for such a time as this that you're in the position you're in? And then if you go to John 4:14, Jesus says, whoever drinks of the water I give him will never thirst, for the water I give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. And then if you go to Hebrews 4:14, it says, let's hold fast to the principles we believe in. That's why Mary and I ran. And one of the principles we believe in is that if we all pay it forward, we can make a difference.
Thank you.
It was fun.